So, all right, welcome to our 2024 edition of Reveal's Ask Me Anything. I'm Chris Lee. I've been associated with Reveal for like the last 29 years since its inception. My partner in crime, Michael Potts here. And in any case, we're planning an agenda this today to look at some different things, some news items over the last 12 months. And we'll hopefully give you some insights as to the state of the ICOC, the International Churches of Christ, as well as the International Christian Churches. If there are any questions, feel free to also throw them our way. And the first thing on our agenda will be the lawsuits, since these were filed on December 30th, 2022. So it's been about a year, and I'm sure a lot of people are curious, like, what's been the response from the International Churches of Christ as well as international Christian churches? What's actually going on? Are these real? Are these what's with the refilings and things like that? And is there more to come? And so we can address a number of those things. Yes, these are real. These are very unfortunate situations that have arisen, unreported instances of sexual abuse across both the international Christian churches and the international churches of Christ. And uh, they have certainly been filed since this is more appropriate at the state level, and also that the statute of limitations has been governed at the state level, that have been refiled as of 6 months ago at the state level more appropriately. A number of these lawsuits have been posted on our main website. So that's the ICOC, ICC lawsuits website. I can also add that to this video. We do know a number of the circumstances, and they're tragic. They're heartbreaking. You can read through them, and you know, it hurts me to feel for such great remorse of what happened, even being an outsider. That so many people were affected, some that were underage, a number of them, I'm sure, had their innocence taken from them, and it's painful to hear about. So we certainly seek justice for them. We hope that truth will come to light, and that certainly there's a lot of damage that's been done, and we can hope for some compensation to happen, and it's to them. I know some people have also asked, like, how can they help in this circumstance? We have an organization called Free to Be, and I know the domain is down currently. They have to renew it. And Shell and a number of others, and I'll also disclose, they asked me about a year ago to be on the board of directors, but I haven't received any money yet. So no checks in the mail. I have not profited from my association, but I can promise you, even on my end, that's, the victims come first. That's my priority. And certainly you can give your donations if somehow you're very blessed, you feel like you would like to contribute. You can also communicate with Free to Be or give them your donations there. There are going to be more lawsuits coming. There is one that's supposedly filed this month, an employment lawsuit in the Boston area. This person was wrongfully terminated for being a whistleblower and attempted to talk to the lead evangelist about sexual abuse that had come to her attention. And when you're a whistleblower, you're supposed to be protected from these things. And unfortunately, this was, we feel, very vindictive of the ICOC to terminate her employment. And then other things have come to light, such as unequal pay between her and her husband. So there will be that lawsuit coming up. The ICOC and the ICEC seem to be pointing fingers at each other, and their response has primarily been, they're talking about the other group. It's not us. And there's a lot of avoidance and deflection. There's a lot of like, hey, these things happened so long ago. These were, I'm sure, a decade or 2 decades ago, when we have some pretty clear evidence it was even fairly recently, for instance, in the Los Angeles Turning Point Ministry, um, where the person who was subject, or one of the people who had perpetrated these abuses, had been shuffled, and this was even 3 years ago. And then the person was moved to another ministry, and then eventually, within the last, I think, 12 to 18 months, told finally to leave. That was disfellowshipped. So this is not decades ago, years ago. This is a relatively recent time frame in terms of a number of these abuses. There's a question in terms of like, what year did the whistleblower? This was 2023, so last year, last calendar year, I should say. So, in any case, anything else? Maybe you have some insight, Michael, in terms of the lawsuits and the responses of the churches.
Right. Okay, so I just went on the website. I think there were a total of 6 at one point. Right now, I only see 4 up on the website, and they're listing the plaintiffs as well. So there are a total of 17 plaintiffs across 4 lawsuits, and even more to come. One thing I thought about the other. Okay, so let's talk about overall the response. So there was a huge response in the first couple of months of 2023. I know our Facebook groups, a lot of people joining and kind of clamoring. It's like, okay, what's going on? This is serious. The responses for all the churches that we saw initially were, holy cow, we don't condone this. So if you have any issues, come to us, come to the leadership. There wasn't explicitly anything to go to the authorities like you're supposed to. Some of them did change that later on, but they definitely underscored, hey, you need to talk to the leadership about this too. So they're doing their best to try and self-contain everything. Again, all the initial lawsuits were filed at the federal level. On the way that the legal system works here in the United States, you have a federal track for federal laws. You have state tracks for all the individual states. So certain laws come under the umbrella of federal or state. So initially, everything was put under, from the way I understood it, from the legal team at the federal level, so that RICO could be on the table, investigative finances. So they backed everything off from the federal, at least at this point. They can refile it federal in the future if they need to. Um, and a kind of funny thing, we know that the Mission Point Church, the one in San Antonio, Texas, that was part of the lawsuit, including Mike Tolliver, several folks down there. They basically announced in midweek the cases have been dismissed, and everybody's yay happy. And only they got refiled. And I don't think we heard a response of like, "Hey guys, those lawsuits? You just refiled them." Um, so they're in the state courts now. I think these other ones that are coming up are against the ones coming here, hopefully very shortly, are going against the ICC at the state level, and some of these other ones are going to be against, Chris said, Boston, um, other things at the state level too. So these other ones are coming. Um, so after that, things just seemed to kind of calm down. We're kind of in a waiting phase just to see what was going on. And the legal team has given out information and kind of hints about where they're going. Um, and we could probably read about some of that stuff online, but it is very concerning, and they're not done yet, not by a long shot. We haven't heard any. I don't think we've heard any updates about the original cases yet. I guess they're going through an investigative phase or something, so they're still around. I guess coming up with some of the other things that have happened, you have some folks. I know Mike Tolliver at least has announced his retirement. He's getting retirement age anyway, so this may have forced him into an early retirement. Um, and something else I pointed out on Facebook the other day, just thinking about this, in terms of scope of this, like if there was a relatively well-known case, or something came to light where, hey, back in 1990 something or other, in the somewhere church, you had brother so and so, he was caught abusing a child, and they called the police. The leadership got around it, and basically they disfellowshipped him. They called all the discipling chains to say, hey, brother so and so has been disfellowshipped. There'll be more updates here at Sunday or midweek or whatever, and basically handle it in a good and respectful way, right? Like within reason. And there are ICOC members and ICC members, obviously, in the Facebook groups, and none of them have spoken up about that. None of them have said, hey, you remember what happened in this church and this thing happened? It's like, it doesn't mean it hasn't happened, but, if you're being accused of not protecting your children who have been sexually abused under your care, and you can provide at least one counterexample, and no counterexamples have been provided, then what does that tell us? So sadly, I think that's kind of helping build the case of not that if you join ICOC, your children will automatically be um, targets of abuse, but the potential for that is most definitely there. And that's why I think at this point, obviously, we need to get the legal system and the state involved to kind of help clamp down on this. So I guess that's pretty much all for the lawsuits. We're just kind of in a waiting pattern to see the next round and what else is going to happen. I know one thing that we've been focused on, at least on the ICC side, is it's perpetual contribution season.
Yeah, it is.
I've been making a lot of memes this year. You're talking about the ICOC and ICC pointing fingers at each other. I had the Spider-Man, the Spider-Man pointing their fingers at each other meme. It's like lawsuits against the other guy. But also the lawsuit of, the meme I made of, it's always, contribution season, spring, summer, fall, winter.
Yeah.
It's missions contribution season. It's second special contribution season. We actually looked at and found some public numbers from some of the ICOC churches and ICC churches and we compared them where I think it was at least New York and Cincinnati announced their totals, and we kind of did division, and we came up with a value. Okay, so an average member in these churches gave about X amount of money for their special contribution. Then we compared that to Los Angeles, the City of Angels church, and it was double. And remember, that was like only one of their two special contributions for the year. So you're paying, if you're in the ICC, you're paying about 4 times in special contribution than the ICOC, which
Mm-hmm.
that's got to be at least 20% of your income, maybe.
Yeah.
You use a classic ICOC numbers about 17% your tithe and your special contribution on top of that. And yeah, so they're definitely kind of stocking up. I also remember off the top of my head, Kip publicly finally responded to lawsuits. He was under the radar for the first kind of several months of 2023. Then he popped up at a conference because, he can't, he's got to talk. He can't keep talking.
Mm-hmm.
He finally came out and basically said that, yeah, well, the original church, they were getting persecuted by the Pharisees and Sadducees. The legal system's coming after us now. But the thing is, God made the church grow. So this is something along the lines of, this is a new vista for world evangelism.
Right.
We counterbalance that with what came out in October. They finally announced their numbers. They're 11,500, and then we did the math on it. They barely grew, and we did some internal math by their numbers that for every 4 people they baptized, 3 are falling away. So
mm-hmm.
they're kind of, and it's some odd value. Like I think about 8% of their membership actually converts someone that stays around more than a year, give or take. So you guys are making disciples. You guys are crummy at making disciples. If you look at the numbers, because it's like following Jesus' system, but yeah, you're spending all this time and effort. You're not, they're not sticking around. Why aren't they sticking around? Um, so I think that's pretty much it on that front with the lawsuits and where things are at right now. We're just waiting for the next round. Um, Another thing I just thought of, you've got leaders, you have kind of fringe leaders, guys are kind of on the fringe or into other groups like Doug Jacoby, Kyle
Oh,
Spears, guys like
Spears. Yeah.
that. So Doug Jacoby, he and Vicky, they moved from, I think they moved from Scotland back to England. And they are no longer a part of an ICOC. They're kind of hosting a house church. And they do like a mini sermon communion thing online. I haven't seen any yet, but they've done some podcasts called Conversations for the past year, and they're going after kind of semi forbidden topics like, is it okay for
Hmm.
me to leave my church? Um, how much should I give in contribution? Do I need to count the cost? So they're kind of in a state where they're kind of questioning things, but they haven't fully hit the button to abandon and bail on everything yet. In some senses, I sympathize with them, but on the other sense, it's like, hey, you hitched your wagon to these things. Now you got to figure out what to do because it's kind of leading the whole train downhill to a fiery end at the bottom of the cliff. Um, so I guess we can probably keep our eye on them. I guess if Doug Jacoby really wants to help, we can probably get a review more of this. Me, you, a couple of other people.
Hmm.
They'll be like, "Hey, what do you think about originals?" Yeah, how about
Right.
that? Yeah, so I don't know. We'll see what happens. I know personally there have been some doors that have kind of opened with some current and former members about stuff, kind of curious about things, but I don't think there's a lot of movement on that. I think it's probably true for a lot of other people as well. Um, I guess we're all waiting to see what the next big shakeup is going to be, and we're presuming it's going to be something with the lawsuits kind of kick in. But other than that, we're just kind of in a holding pattern.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So, last year when we talked about the lawsuits, we said don't expect anything in the short term. I wasn't expecting anything in the 2023 timeframe. Even in the 2024 timeframe, it's hard to say. Our legal system is relatively slow to act. And part of it is that, the we'd like to get to the discovery phase and show a lot more what's going on the inside. We transparency is ideal, and we'd like to see that. Either yes, the ICOC did have the right controls in place, and we're interested in everybody's best interests. Probably not, but we can hope. And on the flip side, that there are other things going on, and if there are more negative things that they did or didn't do, that will also come to light. So certainly we don't bank on the lawsuits having a lot of momentum even in the 2024 timeframe, if at all. Maybe I think it would be optimistic. Probably a bit longer term than that. So that's kind of, I know that's of a lot of interest, but that it's kind of where how I see things. We've talked about the ICC briefly, or you mentioned it, so we might as well jump in and talk about the ICC, and then we'll talk about the ICC, and then your paper. So, you've mentioned the forced contribution from the cities of Angels, and it's unfortunate. It's also very legalistic. They've been telling people, and this is, of course, as Holden Rowan and others have observed, completely contrary to 2 Corinthians 9:7, that there should be no compulsion. You should not be told what to give, and nobody's supposed to tell you like, oh, this is you're a single person, so you have to give $1,000 or $600 or $1,200. You're a married couple, you have to give double that, and this is not just once a year. It's like twice a year. Again, there's some much better teaching outside the ICOC and the ICC on these matters. Like, you're not supposed to give from your student loans. That's not your money. first of all. It's not your even your income, not your. It was lent to you to further your education. So there's a number of teachings outside of the ICOC in terms of you know giving, in terms of not only gratitude and not out of compulsion, but out of what you actually have and what you made, and not from borrowed money, or if you have to go up to mom and dad and say, I need another $2,000 to give to this church. Well, that is also unbiblical. Um, so the ICC has been heavily pressuring their members, and I think rightly so. We think that they are stocking up, maybe a war chest for their lawsuits. Um, One of the things that they've been really hammering, of course, and that differentiates them from their former fellowship, is this idea of central leadership. And so by central leadership, they really mean like going, is somewhat hidden, but it goes all the way up to KIP, of course. And other than that, it's their world sector leaders. And there's a number of them that are in control, and they have more control over the rest of the churches. So that's kind of one of their points. They're trying to say like the ICOC is going more towards the seemingly more like autonomy, and then they're saying that this is of course not biblical, and you'll never find the word autonomous, although
They've returned
in
to a
going.
mainline Church of Christ theology.
Yes, exactly.
No, no, no.
And yes, and it seems like as you go through their literature over the last 45 years that they've been around, and even further, that they use autonomy to suit their needs. So if it's like, well, something's happened here, it's more like, well, it's autonomous, and that's why it's not that you'll find all the abuses everywhere. And so autonomy is invoked whenever they need a straw man or whatever, they need something to point at. And otherwise it's back to the central leadership under Boston, Los Angeles, Kip, whoever it is. But it's primarily seems to be invoked to benefit Kip, or to have his dictates. So Mike also observed that for every four join, three leave. Yes, this is not too surprising.
Right.
Anything else
The
that you've
benchmark, yeah, the benchmark number for the ICOC where they started to get concerned in the 90s was 3 people get baptized, 2 leave. So I'm assuming it's still roughly around there for the current ICOC, but the ICC started on the downhill right now. That tends to be kind of the start of the downhill uh, spin out, because they can't keep that up for very long. I know that we know that there's been a big push in 2023 in Los Angeles to have 1,000 members, and they did it, but they lost several hundred people, not by people leaving, going on mission teams or anything, but just leaving the church altogether. Um, but they can't keep up that pace for very
Mhm.
long. It can't be sustained. We saw that even Andy Fleming, when he analyzed the original numbers from the Boston movement back in the 80s and 90s. It gets to a certain point where it naturally stalls out and things shrink. And we don't know
Yep.
if they're they that's at least a external indicator that something is that slowdown may start and accelerate sometime. We don't have any sure indic- hard indicators like that, but that one is kind of a tell that it's not going in the right direction, at least from what they would want to see.
Great. I think one kind of interesting case that happened, and it was about 4 or 5 months ago, was in Chicago. There were a couple that left. I ended up talking with these people, and then also an extended family left, and in effect, uh, eventually about 20 to 25 people eventually left, and that was a pretty significant amount. And this is in the Chicago International Christian Church, to be very clear. And kind of what is interesting about that is that the relationships and the friendships actually transcended the ICC's dictates. And so when the leaders of the Chicago church did a number of nasty things and started bad mouthing the first couple, they this got out, and they that was the last straw for them. They left, but then they started talking to their friends a little bit, or their friends were curious and said, "Hey, what's going on? We heard this about you. We didn't think this was the case." And then that became the last straw for the extended couples, and so on and so forth. So as we're seeing information being disseminated, this has also been the case for Fulton Roan. This is, to a lesser degree, some other churches in the ICC. As people have gotten kicked out or mistreated, their circumstances have finally begun to caught up. The truth has come out and is known. So hopefully more of that will happen, and people will find out the truth about the ICC and also the ICOC, their heavy-handedness. Look, guys, it doesn't have to be this way, right? Michael and I and a number of other people here are Christians. We're dedicated. We study the Bible. I'm a seminary graduate. I spent 7 years part time. I did my whatever 60,000, 70,000 pages of reading and studied the original languages and many many hours on this stuff. And I'm still a committed follower of Jesus Christ today. That this is my one thing that when I come to Jesus, I hope that he will say, well done, good and faithful servant. Although on my side it'll be more like, please have mercy on me, a sinner. Because that's where I am. I know, my standing. But at the same time, we're all for truth. And you know there's going to be some people who are going to be like, well, I am committed to these organizations. We're not telling you not to be committed to God, but it's, clearly that these organizations are corrupt. It's not just a matter that there's a few, bad apples or things like that. There's systemic problems. You have better choices. And, we're going to expose and continue to expose where there's problems and where there's untruth and where there's uh, mangling of the Bible, where this is misused. Okay. Uh, Anything else on the ICC side before we switch over to the ICOC?
I guess they're going to finish their Project Eagle this year, where they're going to have a church in every state. We'll see how long that
Mm,
lasts. Because the ICOC, you had one in North or South Dakota that closed shop during that time when they were trying to get a church in every state.
okay.
So keep our eye on it, see what happens.
All right. In the ICOC side, as Stephen Marcia has observed, that it's not fully autonomous. They'd like to say that they're heading more towards autonomy, but there's very, very clearly a structure. We've talked about some of these in the past. I won't, show any more pictures. We can certainly link them, but the churches in the ICOC have both natural discipling relationships where, so for instance, the people are going up a hierarchy and it's going back to, certain people like Walter Evans, and Philadelphia seems to be near or at the top of the totem pole there. A number of other people, uh, that it's more hidden that it's a pyramid. It's not as, there were, I think in 20 years ago, let's say, there was much more, the world missions evangelist was Kip, and then there's the world sector leaders, and then there are the whatever the super region leaders and so on, all the way down through the various individual churches, and then house church leaders and discipleship group leaders, and then Bible talk leaders, and so on and so forth, where it was much more obvious that it was pyramidal, or at least you could draw that pyramid. Nowadays, it's part of it is that it's through the discipling relationship, so you can ask who disciples who or who reports into who. And there's still that kind of control. But there's the second dynamic that's evolved, which is that there are councils or committees. They might be called service teams, and we saw this with so Steve and Lisa Johnson at one point in time wanted to talk about their version of egalitarianism, that women, if they were properly uh, skilled and equipped with the Holy Spirit, could teach in a mixed setting. And this is actually something that, evangelicalism has struggled with like 30 years ago or 40 years ago, and they've thought a lot about it. Um, and there's a lot of writings on the topic, and largely it's a settled issue in evangelicalism. You don't really hear that it's a big bone of contention. And there's occasional debate about it, but it's not clearly as fierce as in the ICOC. And Steve and Lisa Johnson decided, like, oh, we feel strongly this way, that, they called it mutualism. Women could teach in a mixed setting. And this caused some strife, especially with the more conservative or whatever, more traditionalist viewers within the ICOC. And eventually the elder service team had to step in, and Kim and others sent a letter that basically said, guys, they actually replanted uh, the church right away, but didn't tell them that they were going to get booted. And then within, I think it was like 6, 7 weeks, eventually Portland was delisted off Disciples Today, their main website, and then told, go sit over there. You're, of course, welcome to family gatherings and regional gatherings, but you're just not welcome to teach on it. And we're not going to recognize you as an ICOC church anymore. So last year we were like, it's not quite the penalty box. It's something a little bit worse than that. It's something like, the person's not even on the team where they got cut, and they're not even being recognized on the practice squad or something equivalent.
They move behind the penalty box into the second row of seats where the
Yeah,
fans
something
are.
like that.
Yeah.
Hmm.
It's kind of interesting that you bring that up. That happened in fall of 2022, and we were looking at, there were other recognitions of other churches and other larger groups, especially on the West Coast. I know Seattle was brought up. Maybe a couple of regions in Los Angeles area were brought up, or kind of supporting mutuality. And we haven't seen a lot of push, and we haven't seen a lot of activity from that in 2023. So maybe I would guess that it's still kind of simmering under the surface a little bit. It just hasn't come to a boil yet, if it will, because none of these other, we haven't heard that, the lead evangelist of Seattle's like, oh, we're going to do mutuality, and then they're going to get kicked out. So it's also kind of interesting because at that point, when they removed Portland from the ICOC co-op list, that they officially made the ICOC's position complementarianism, which they were pretty much implicitly complementarianism from the start. It's like we didn't make it a formal piece of doctrine until a dividing line of you're in, you're out until that point. And it's at least their version of complementarianism, because for some people, you can have, you have, and I guess in the ICOC, you have to have, on the ICC too, you have to have, men discipling men, women discipling women. So women kind of have more shepherding and control of women than a typical evangelical church, which is complementarian and men are leaders. So yeah, it's the ICOC version of complementarianism, but
Hmm.
weird. But we haven't,
Yeah, and
again, we
then
haven't seen any push from any other ICOC congregations to kind of investigate this. It's kind of been Portland on their own for a little over a year now.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, certainly the ICOC, we've talked a little bit about that. And in terms of like let me see if I can I will share my screen very quickly again. So we've shown this graphic before, and we'll just full screen it. So, basically based on their website. So the ICOC's websites are not just Disciples Today. They also have this ICOC co-op website. And that we've figured out, there's a number of service teams that they've identified. So for example, there's the elder service team that we talked about that dealt with the Portland church. And that's primarily their role. They will deal with conflicts in between churches. So there is also a catalyst team, and we've heard some reports back. It's not quite, uh, they're not quite the top team. They're supposed to be both facilitators as well as administrators and advisors. So they do have on their team, as it indicates, there's all the regional family chairmen and the women's chairs. So again, there is a hierarchy, and that there are these, regional family chairmen, and then add to that two teachers, an elder, two women's ministry leaders, and one person from the missions co-op task force. That's kind of like they're coordinating, but they're facilitating and advising all the churches, um, and they're more behind the scenes. Then you have, a number of these other uh, structures underneath. So, for example, there's the 160 in the ICOC delegates, of which I think, a number of them are also pillar churches. And then there's the, 750 to 800 ICOC churches, where they're represented by, not only their lead evangelists, but then into the delegates. Um, so this is, the structure that we've been talking about that exists today. So, um, certainly we've heard from ICOC teachers and maybe even advisors, people on these committees. And I've talked to one. I'm not going to reveal his name, partly because he's not given me permission. But he's indicated that there's multiple ICOC subcultures that have developed, and I have yet to, really delve into that a whole lot. Yeah, there's definitely streams that are more pragmatic or more, oriented towards complementarianism, or more mainline, more. There's definitely some that are a little bit more wanting to saddle up to the churches of Christ, the mainstream churches of Christ, and that want to talk nice and play nice. I think Michael reached out to some of the people in the mainstream churches of Christ to kind of say, like, hey, they want you to come under their discipling umbrella. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so the theory from that leader, I on the surface, I agree with it because I think from if you look at it from a kind of the mainline Church of Christ flavor of that. So you have your regular mainline Church of Christ, you have your non-instrumental, your non-institutional Church of Christ. It is okay, you can't use the church treasury to support orphanages or seminaries or whatever. You have the one cup Churches of Christ saying, okay, you have to use one cup for communion, and you have these different variants. And if you're in one and you go to another, except probably for the mainline one because they don't have any other additional restrictions, it's like, okay, well, you got to do this now. We do in our church, otherwise you're in sin, you're going to hell. So it's a post salvation stipulation they put on there. But if you go back and you look at the core doctrine of how to become saved, it's still the same: hear, confess, repent, be baptized, confess, be baptized. And your baptism only counts if you believe it's for the forgiveness of sins. So underneath the core of these other churches of Christ flavors, kind of adding that, you have that core that's common to all of them. And I believe from what I see and kind of look at his mom, I want to kind of see a little bit more where he digs into it a little bit more. It's kind of the same dynamic where, yeah, you have churches that, kind of are a traditional ICOC trying to be kind of do some discipling, kind of have some type of hierarchy or tier, and churches over churches and stuff like that. You have some that are more politically liberal, on the West Coast, the ones that are kind of going toward the mutuality, the egalitarianism. You've got some that are actually branching out into house churches. I think there's one, Asheville, North Carolina, is kind of trying to do the house church, micro church, mini church. I don't know. What's the difference? I don't know. They're just small. Um, Trying to do that type of thing with discipling. So, yeah, you have different flavors. And of course, you have the classic vanilla flavor of the ICC, because again, up until from 1979 all the way to 2003 with Kip at the helm, there was one flavor and you were going to do what Kip says. So you technically have that flavor in the ICC. But again, what's undergirding all of these kind of different flavors is the same base. You have to become a disciple before you're baptized, and then you can truly be saved. Um, and again, no other ICOC congregation, definitely no ICC congregation either, has come out and said, okay, this is a false gospel. We're not going to use it anymore. And especially if you look at some churches that have left the ICOC and kind of become basically accepted by the independent Christian churches, the moderate stream and Stone Campbell movement, where, they're just accepted, like, okay, we're one of us now. All right. But at least on one of those websites, specifically the DC Regional Christian Church, led by Daryl Reed, because the ICOC had to replant the ICOC congregation in Washington D.C. itself, now called the Capital Collective. I went on the DC Regional Church's website, and lo and behold, you had their copy of pretty much First Principles, and it's First Principles. It's like, you need to study this with someone else to help iron sharpen iron. It's like, oh yeah, this is First Principles in so many words. And no one in the independent Christian churches was kind of like raising any concerns or alarm about this. Which kind of leads me to another point. There's a guy on YouTube channel called Ready to Harvest, and he does an excellent research on all sorts of Christian denominations and kind of comparing, just not only the larger groups, kind of like, okay, well, you got your Catholics and your Eastern Orthodox, and you got your Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, yada yada yada. But he goes into some depth into some of these like smaller offshoots, like really, here's a very small type of Presbyterians that kind of do this thing. It's really interesting. He just recently posted a video on the independent Christian churches, and watching it, all the feedback from Christian church members are like, okay, hey, this is really good, this is really accurate, this is what we believe. Okay, but here's the interesting thing: he puts the Christian churches, Churches of Christ, the mainline Churches of Christ, the ones that don't use instruments, the Disciples of Christ, the progressives, and the International Churches of Christ. He puts them all on the same tier.
Hmm.
He's communicating that the ICOC is pretty much just an offshoot of the Church of Christ, kind of like how the Christian churches up through from the early 1900s all the way to like 1968, when the Disciples of Christ formed, they were kind of one group, and then they just kind of split off from each other.
Mhm.
Which I think is really interesting, because if he's seeing the ICOC treated as that, and internally the Christian churches and Church of Christ are kind of seeing the ICOC as kind of, hey, we're all on the same team here. They're both being presented by both internally and externally the same. I think that's really um, interesting and yet alarming at the same time.
Mhm.
I know that the Christian Chronicle, the main reporting paper for the mainline Churches of Christ, reported on the lawsuits maybe a couple of weeks after they came out. It wasn't too long. The Christian Standard, the paper on the Christian church side, hasn't had anything on it.
Mhm.
So again, we'll have to see what comes of this and where things are going. But it seems like if you're an ICOC congregation, you kind of want to split and kind of say, hey, we're an independent Christian church now, then you can find a new home, even though internally you're still practicing what the ICOC has practiced.
Right. First
Um,
principles,
and
discipling.
especially since you have that the group, which kind of is coming from the independent Christian churches, kind of the Stone Campbell stream in general, called renew.org, discipleship.org. We're trying to do, hey, let's do discipling. And ICOC is kind of like, some folks are kind of snuggling into that, kind of like, hey, we do discipling. So, um, what year is this? Is this not, is this the late 60s? What is going on here? So, and I don't think they've done anything with any reporting or anything with lawsuits either. So, um, it's a really interesting time to be a part of the Stone Campbell movement. Let's just put it. If you're really kind of paying attention and kind of really seeing some of the history of what's happening when the discipling theology met the Stone Campbell movement the first time,
Right.
and are we going to have a repeat? Um, that remains to be seen. But right now, it's just kind of wait and see, and kind of I have the Michael Scott meme face, kind of like kind of watching this. It's like, oh,
Mhm.
please don't happen what I think is what may happen or what happened last time. Please, no, 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 no. So that's my 2 cents on that.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I noticed, for instance, that the Common Grounds people republished their 2019 uh, video relatively recently, and I'd say republished. Part of it is that it they said, "Oh, this happened relatively recently," but it was actually before COVID. So, Common Grounds was an effort. Primarily, it's Nick Zola, who became a member in the Boston Church of Christ and did a lot of his campus ministry when he was, I believe, at Olin, and then he now teaches at Pepperdine, which is a mainline Churches of Christ school. And Doug Jacoby was also there. So the two of them are in a way spearheading an effort to kind of say, we'd like to play nice with the mainline Churches of Christ again. Yes, we would like to recognize that, yeah, there's some bad blood between us, or we had a few spats, we had a bit of a fallout, but you guys are at fault too. Meaning like the mainline Churches of Christ also had their things to their role to play, and how they portrayed the Boston movement and Crossroads and the International Churches of Christ. But there is still an effort to play nice between the International Churches of Christ on the one hand and the mainline Churches of Christ. And I think some of the mainline Churches of Christ to people are, trying not to poison the well, or ruin the relationships. They're kind of, oh, we'll wait and see, and if there's really clearing of the air between us, maybe there's some bad blood that happened.
Yeah, I think in the past year, someone dug up, I think a mainline Church of Christ sympathizer guy on the internet. He dug up the tapes from Abilene Christian University in 1990 from Dr. Jerry Jones and Kyle Dang, and they're sounding the alarms and red alert. It was like, okay, discipling got in. It's messed up a lot of stuff. This is our fault. We need to help, not protect us, but protect other people and help get them to kind of find their footing when they leave. And just, but now it's kind of like, eh, this is a misunderstanding.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. I did want to pick up on one thing that they mentioned, and I kind of thought it was very telling. So, you know, that Jacoby actually said, well, some legalism snuck in, and he defined legalism as this rigidity in terms of our, I'll use the word tradition, but maybe habits as a different way of putting it. And he said, oh, we had some legalism. We expected things to be done a certain way, and we wanted it our way. And I don't think that is fair to the word legalism. There's at least three type of three types of legalism, all of which are condemned. So the first is, works righteousness. And by that, I mean, I'm right before God because of the things that I do. I basically look at my spiritual resume at the end of the day and I go, oh, look, I'm so awesome because I've given 10%, or I've you know, spoken to 20 new people, or I've had 5 new baptisms in the last month, or, 3 studies, or whatever it is. And unfortunately, that is very much part of the spirituality that's promoted by the ICOC and the ICC, right? It's there is certainly, works righteousness, and you are better because you do these things. And um, you know, in contrast, for instance, the Bible, I know it's horribly not well understood and it's not taught very well, but this key idea of justification, like, you go through the book of Romans, especially in the Greek, there's this word, dikaiosune, um, dikaiao, and all the ways that it's conjugated. It's the word righteousness, right, declared as righteous, justify. It's running all through, Romans, Galatians, and that my right standing before God is not because of what I've done or my spiritual track record or all the awesome things that I might think about, or things like that, my spiritual resume. No, it's I trusted Jesus Christ, who was the perfect sacrifice for my sin. And that is the good news. And the bad news is every person has gone astray, and has decided to do whatever in his life or her life. And we have this free gift from Jesus. And, it's this failure of understanding of justification that's, throughout the International Church of Christ and international Christian churches. So you feel guilty when you don't, make your quotas or your, things like that, the things that you should do. And that's very dangerous, first of all, the work righteousness part. The second thing is when you overemphasize one part of the law. Jesus talks about, even if it's the Sabbath, if you see your donkey falling in a ditch, wouldn't you help your donkey? Or he talks about, well, you Pharisees, you focus so much on giving a tenth of all that you have, your herbs, um, and it's that they focus so much more on the ceremonial laws and these things that they forget that there are moral laws that are more important. So there's kind of that the difference between ceremonial laws and the timeless moral laws. And the third type that's very prevalent is adding or subtracting from the law of God, adding or subtracting from the requirements. And this is very blatantly abused. And when you start saying things like, well, you know, I'll contrast a bit. So Paul, for example, in 1 Corinthians 7, contrasts when it is wise, or it's his advice versus it's the Lord's advice. And there's other times where it says, these things are unwise to do. And if you start moving the unwise category over to the forbidden, or, this is wise to do, into required, that's where you start adding and subtracting to the requirements. And, the ICOC will start saying things like, well, you weren't baptized in a discipling church. And it's like, well, but it doesn't say that it has to be a discipling church. So you just added to the requirements. And so there, even things like seeking out advice to marry a believer, then it's like
Right.
rejiggered, and
The whole
you
dating
really
system.
whole dating system. You have to get advice, and it has to be like appropriately approved, and it has to be somebody within the church, and so on and so forth.
Apparently,
And
it's being according to post that again. Uh-oh.
oh,
We lose you for a
you're
second?
okay. Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, I was
I'm good
saying,
now,
yeah,
I think.
okay. We had a recent post on Facebook where it turns out that they are even in the ICOC, they're starting to clamp down on the dating system again.
Hmm.
I know it was loosened from my last couple of years in there from 2003 to 2006. You still, there was no way you were going to get married without the leadership giving their seal of approval, but it was a little more lenient. But now it's kind of like, from some of the reports, there's like, hey, you're forbidden to talk to this sister you have an interest in. It's like, okay, well, it's old school. And meanwhile, in Kip's group, apparently, if you get enough money, you could literally buy your way to getting married. So
Hmm.
there's that too. There's Joshua Thompson. Hello.
Right. So in all, I I turned this over to Michael, since I think that you've done the analysis. So you came up with a paper about 11 months ago, and in looking at the ICOC, looking at the ICC, looking at fruits, looking at where they're at and where they're headed, um, you know, take us through a little bit, and what did you conclude?
Okay, that's the it's no good paper from February, maybe March of last year. I'm trying to remember. I wanted to come out on the 30th, the 20th anniversary date of the Henry Crete letter, but it was delayed a little bit because we got two young kids. But generally, first of all, you have to recognize that I wrote most of that paper before the lawsuits, even though I'd
Hmm.
have a blurb in there about, okay, now we have, after everything I said, we have the lawsuits to worry about now to involve in the mix. But basically, from the ICOC's perspective, for the first 10 years after the Henry Crete letter, they were kind of getting their footing and kind of getting back to get on a path. The previous 10 years, from like 2013 to 2022, give or take, um, they haven't moved too much. Um, they're trying to get, you have factions that are trying to get discipling going again, but it's not, they can't put the pedal to the metal and kind of enforce things because, you would enter in the same scenario that you would have back when Kip was running the entire show. So you've got these divisions and factions and people leaving, and it's just kind of stuck. And there's no easy way out. They're just trying to. I think I made a metaphor for it. It's like it's a flaming garbage barge going down the river, and then you have chunks of the garbage kind of falling off on occasion. So you don't want to get too close to it. It's not like back in the old ICOC days or even the ICC days now, where you've got the Titanic literally coming at you full steam, kind of sink you. It's this garbage barge you just kind of want to avoid. Um, and again, there could still be a lot of things that come from that. Um, could be other splinter groups, spin-off groups. One
Yeah.
of the things I think I put in there was anticipating you have a split of liberal ICOC congregations. I know Portland probably would be under that banner. We haven't seen any more from that, and them to form a conglomeration or a
Hmm.
network.
Hmm.
And there are other ones where everyone likes Marty Solomon because ICOC teaching is not that deep. Um, it's basically the same things over and over and over again. You talk about them trying to go through Romans. Let me exegete Romans. Let me talk to you about the exegete the book of Romans for you from the ICOC perspective. All right, Romans. So Paul wrote this to the disciples in Rome, and basically the first part of it, y'all are sinners and all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. But Jesus died on the cross, and that was awesome, so that we can be saved. So make sure you're baptized, because it says so in Romans 6, because that's how you become a true disciple. And Jesus is awesome, and that's how he saves the Jews too, blah, blah, blah. Okay, Romans 12. Let's slow down way much for Romans 12 because, again, they just skip everything into Romans 12. So anyway, back to the paper. On the ICC side, they're still trying to do their thing. Um, I probably wouldn't try to remember any specifics, but basically it's just they're still going and Kip is getting older and there doesn't look like to be there's any obvious successor. I know there was that one campus guy that people were calling the Justin Bieber of the movement. There was a video of Kip patting him on the shoulders like, "Hey dude, you're my man." Um, Sounds like he sounded more like a ring announcer for a heavyweight boxing fight. Defending reigning. Um, so that's still up in the air, but I think again the seeing hard numbers where number one we see the ratio of people who are joining to leaving 4 to 3, along with the excessive special contribution, along especially with Kip's current model where the ICC model that really hasn't changed that much. Besides, its embryonic stage in Portland, where you have one central hub megachurch, Los Angeles, and then you try and plant as many churches as possible outside of there and kind of keep them, most of them relatively small, so you can keep planting in smaller cities. And basically, you raise people up where they can barely lead, and then you send them out to lead a mission team in most cases. Um, Obviously, that's not sustainable, and we may be seeing the indications of the beginning of the end to some degree of some of that, um, because of that. And then you're collecting, all the special contribution money for people, and again, it's just unsustainable. And you're again, these are those probably are signs of the beginning of the death spiral for this, but it's still a little too early to absolutely call it. Um,
Right.
but I don't know. We'll see what happens. Again, there could be Kip 2.0 out there. It could be that one guy that they pointed out. It could be someone else we haven't seen yet. There could be a Kip 2.0 in the ICOC that pulls people off. I know that I did mention in there was a Christian apologist who does a lot of stuff with Mormonism, Latter-day Saints, I should say. They're not being called Mormons anymore. They're Latter-day Saints. Fine. Okay, cool. But basically he's seeing the difference between where they started earlier in their ministry back in the 80s and 90s, where you have Mormons who actually believe the Latter-day Saint doctrine, and they'll converse with them and argue and all that other stuff with them. And then today you find fewer and fewer folks like that, and you look at the younger people and they're just kind of like there, just kind of like hanging out. um, he says, and I think this is something that probably they need, and probably Christians in general, at least those involved in apologetics, concerned about Latter-day Saints. There could be someone who could, charismatic personality, could stand up and say, you know what, these old bozo apostles here, they're leading our church who are older than dirt, are leading us into the ground, and they're not actually following the teachings of the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith and all the other prophets that came before us. So they could set off potentially a more conservative reboot, like smaller splinter group off the Latter-day Saints. Um, and that's definitely a possibility. It hasn't happened yet, that we can tell. But there's nothing that's stopping the ICOC or ICC from doing that with some other younger charismatic leader that could do that. Something to keep an eye on. And we also know, kind of another thing I just thought of with the ICC, we saw at least maybe 2 or 3 couples or groups leave. I know a couple of them were involved with the lawsuits, but they decided to start their own house church movement or micro church movement. So we have some of these groups that are kind of leaving and kind of starting their own thing. I don't think they would be very big. I know there was one who was talking about someone who left the ICC, and it sounded pretty brutal. There were only like 80 people out in the Southern California area. So again, it's I guess you could probably expect to see that both coming from former members of the ICOC and ICC up through the next couple of years or so. Because again, there's no one on the ICOC side that everyone can rally around and agree on kind of, okay, you're not KIP, but we trust you to lead us and disciple us.
I know that there's definitely some people who would like, even some former members who have said that they would like to see maybe some closer integration between the mainline Church of Christ and the International Church of Christ that would mitigate some of the more problematic practices. But I think we we've to answer Josh's question, yes, it's that's one way to put it, that they are a shell of their former self, but you know there were a number of their more legalistic and problematic practices over the years, and they continue a number of these. So kind of one benchmark for at least myself is they still refuse to abandon first principles, and they still hammer and use their first principles, and until that's kind of key for me, because it's that's their catechism. That's what they're teaching,
Right.
right? They're using that to make new Christians that way, or the new disciples. And
And it's not
um,
only recognizing and admitting, okay, this is a false gospel, we got the wrong gospel, but it's also the methodology, it's the thought reform system, because you just can't slam first principles into someone and explain it in 5 minutes like you can the gospel in most cases. You got to have to split everything out and go into depth and stuff and make sure they emotionally respond to certain phases to move on to the next stage. They got to
right.
reject both sides.
Hmm.
I know in the chat, Nikita and Ashley made the point recently that if you want to know where these churches are headed, look at their campus ministry and what they're teaching. And that's absolutely true as well, because again, the revealed golden goose, their terminology, is the campus ministry, and they're moving and pushing the campus ministry to operate like it has been over the past 5 decades or so, because it's a proven, quote unquote, proven system that's been refined, and they just need to work the system. And you got your campus students, you got your families, you get your families with children, potentially new children, and then you've got leadership coming from that. So it's basically all still built around the campus ministry. Um, and I know we haven't heard, I think we probably heard more issues from campus ministries from the ICC, not from the ICOC side too much. I know, kind of keeping my eye on the one here in Cincinnati, which is kind of more of a hub and kind of a larger one. I don't think they've made a lot of hubbub on the campuses here recently. They're not converting anyone in overwhelmingly large numbers, though. But um, yeah, again, it's this tension within the ICOC of the people who want to kind of go back to the old ways without KIP, and people just kind of stuck and just trying to figure out a way to move forward with what they've been taught and what they have on their plate. Um, I know there's someone that he is kind of doing a Bible study, trying to discover, kind of go back and kind of solidify the roles of, evangelist, elder, teacher, deacon, some of the major offices and stuff like that. And it's hard, because again, you look at some of the stuff, even the obvious stuff, it's been like, there's not much on an evangelist, and the evangelists are kind of acting like elders in a lot of places, but they're not elders. They don't have the character
Right.
qualifications, at least in the beginning. Um, so why do they have all the power? So it's an interesting mess. But then again, they don't have someone to help galvanize some of these things, so they're just kind of floating out on their own, kind of trying to figure out how to move forward.
Right.
And the key is if there is someone with the charisma to kind of help pull everything together at some level, how many people are going to want to follow that and go into that? Especially since you can kind of look on the other side of the fence and look what's going on with the ICC.
Mhm.
So interesting times.
Absolutely. You had brought up the Ready to Harvest paper, I think, Michael. So maybe we'll bring that up.
Oh yeah, the Ready to Harvest video. Yeah, I think I already
The
mentioned
video,
that.
yeah, video. Right. Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
So, and
Um,
again, the primary thing is just kind of see not only how the ICOC is positioning itself, at least in parts, as kind of, hey, we want to play nice and interact with the larger Stone Campbell movement, the Christian churches and the churches of
yeah,
Christ and the non-instrumental churches of Christ. But from the, I think the guy's name's Josh, from the guy who runs the channel and does the research and everything, from his perspective, especially from someone on the outside, he's seeing the same thing too. Because he just sees the ICOC as just pretty much kind of a subgroup like the disciples of Christ, Christian churches, churches of Christ. Instead of like, oh, we need to separate this. Is he hasn't mentioned the ICC. I
yeah,
think he might have mentioned them once, but kind of separating them into like, okay, these guys are separate because these guys are a clear cult,
right.
which obviously you need to do currently with the current ICOC, but I know they're not. No one is as concerned as we are that. Wait a minute, these guys are still culty here. Hold on. So,
Yeah. And even like in terms of like the culty thing, it was mentioned actually very recently. I think it was Thursday or Friday. We had a confirmation, and we had known this for some time. So um, it was merely confirmatory rather than a revelation, and that there are ICOC, I mean ICC, and we also know that there's ICOC leaders that whether it's cyber evangelists who are up to no good. Well, they're not doing anything, but they have altered their names and have shill accounts or shell accounts that are monitoring us on some of the public websites. So, or at least on the Facebook groups, and are reporting back. So, just be aware of that. Um, yes, it's an indication of PR management or mind control or things like that. Certainly, they are watching that information and are trying to report back and deal with it. I don't know that many churches that healthy churches that do that kind of thing. Healthy churches are much more like we're trying to advance the gospel, and we don't have to like manage our image that much. Um, a kind of another set of interesting questions I think that we've kind of raised is how does change happen? And I left this question on the forums. Think about for people who are either thinking about returning, people who are thinking about leaving, or even current members, you can think about how does change happen. And I didn't want to answer, my own question at the time. I left it as a thought exercise, or at least, to get you to think about these things. And what we've observed is, if you're an insider, so you're a member, that the power to say like decide whether there's going to be an additional service, or if it's a devo or a midweek or things like that, the average person doesn't have that kind of control or influence. There's an oligarchy. It's a few people who determine pretty much all the decisions in the church. How much you're going to raise, how much is spent, what is spent on, what the salaries are. um, you know the, there's a lot that's concentrated to these small number of people. And moreover, they can't just rock the boat. And so, for example, when Kyle Spears was publishing some of his messages, he was actually told by quite a few members and leaders, like, hey, if I said what you said, or if I really challenged, the stance on these things, I'd lose my position so fast, or I wouldn't be able to maintain my position on certain things. So it's kind of not only an oligarchy, but there's kind of an established way of doing things, and you cannot, rock the boat too much. So there's definitely the sacred cows and things like that. And alternately, how does change happen? Well, you leave, and that should tell you a lot. The main way that you change an organization is if you leave it. So it's kind of unfortunate, but it tells me a lot about the health of that organization. So,
Yeah,
some people go ahead, Michael.
yeah, it's hard because you have to, at least in the ICOC case, you have to cut off your relationships with people, um, basically get yourself healed first, and then you can kind of help dive back in to help other people. But a lot of them don't want help until after they leave. Part of it is kind of realizing that things are unreformable to some degree. Um, Even within maybe even certain congregations and certain churches, you may have group A and group B kind of fighting over methodology, ways to certainly do things, and they ought to kind of exist under one roof. Um, it's not like you can do like a mainline Church of Christ thing, kind of split, kind of have two congregations. At least not yet. Just shows you how much the discipling and everything kind of makes everything, the relationships, keep everything is kind of intertwined and difficult, if not impossible, to move forward in a lot of places. Um, but at some point, you're going to have a Henry Crete level type of event where, you got to face the music. Um, Maybe the lawsuits will be that. I don't know. We'll see what happens. That's kind of another thing. I don't think there have been any leaders, at least publicly. The legal team probably knows because obviously you talk to the legal team if you're gonna be like a high level leader, kind of like says, "Holy cow, yeah," their conscience is pricked, and it's like, okay, yeah, I don't care what happens to me or my family. We need to get out of here. We need to do the right thing, and basically go to the legal team and just tell them everything and kind of help out, leave and stuff like that. We haven't seen any. I'm not aware of any high profile cases or high level leaders that have done that yet. Um, just everything is kind of stuck. I guess that's kind of another thing that they're trying to do, at least kind of help out on the ICC side, is kind of like kind of put pressure on leaders and other people with things because ultimately we're just kind of waiting on someone's gonna turn their back on Kip at some point, maybe. Um, but it's that thing where you're gonna give up everything. Ironically, hey, give up everything, right? Go anywhere, give up everything to do the right thing and turn on Kip versus um, go down with the ship. And right now, we're seeing predominantly leaders kind of, at least on the ICC side, they're going down with the ship, at least at this point. And of course, the ICOC side, it's more like that. But then you've got people on the edge, like this Kyle Spears, Doug Jacoby, just kind of on the edge enough to kind of rock the boat a little bit. And Doug Jacoby he delivered a sermon where he just laid things out, and like back in, when was it? I think it was in the spring of 2023. He was in Athens, Georgia, at where the University of Georgia is, and he's got a deep history with them, and he's well connected. But basically, Doug was just railing on everything, and it was great. And people were like, "Yeah, Doug, go, go, go," and nothing came of it. um, so there's that. It just shows you it's gonna may take a Henry Crete level event to
Right.
dislodge people, and that may become part of the maybe build off the lawsuits or something. But
Yeah, I think, Marcia and Steve actually brought up something that's really interesting, which is, how does change happen if you refuse to acknowledge that, specifically anything that was wrong? And, lots of times it's kind of portrayed as isolated incidents or, oh, of course, mistakes were happened. Kind of sadly, I think somebody showed me on one of the restoration forums recently. This is dialogue between, I shall not say the name, but it's somebody that's knowledgeable about the ICOC growth. And um, and we'll also say it's not Kelsey Hahn. For I've been in contact with Kelsey Hahn, but it's not Kelsey Hahn. Um, so, anyways, and throughout the 70s, the 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, and even recently, this is like a few weeks ago, they showed me this post, and the it's pretty much justified like, oh, for a movement as great as ours, like how many people have we baptized? Like, a million or roughly, right? They have 115,000 members in the ICOC and 11,500, so a tenth in the or 112,000, sorry, in the ICOC and 11,500 in the ICC. But there's been, closer to three-quarters of a million plus in former members. So that, they kind of see it as, well, for a movement as great as ours, as big as ours, there's going to be a few broken eggs. And that's, kind of minimizing the damage. And it's also kind of portraying it as uh, a few broken eggs, right? It's not like seven times the number of former members or whatever it is as there are members, and never acknowledgement of any systemic problems. So they're not, as Marcia and Steve realize, it's not taking responsibility for what is happening or what has happened.
Especially since we're seeing now with the lawsuits, um, the potential for the leadership to hide and kind of pull under the covers, any sexual abuse of a minor not reported to the authorities, that is baked in as a real possibility everywhere. It's not just one location; it's everywhere. It's been going on since even beginning back with Crossroads back in the '60s and '70s. I'm thinking of the line in Ghostbusters where they're down in the basement where the ghost containment unit, and Egon does the Twinkie analogy. Well, imagine a Twinkie this size. It's like, well, yeah, you have a few broken eggs of an omelet to make an omelet. So here's an omelet of this size. Like, that's a big omelet, and it's sadly, to their shame, it is a giant, it is a huge omelet at this point. Because again, we've calculated the bare minimum of former members of the ICOC is 750,000. I think in the lawsuits it says it's maybe 1 or 1.1 million. That's probably closer to the actual number.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, and then the
And
ICC
that's
side, I don't know. I don't know if we calculated any former ICC side numbers, but it's
no,
got to be what 300,000 at least, maybe 200, 2 to 300,000 at this point,
I have no clue.
maybe.
Not sure what to say. Because there's been some switching, right? We had people like Gabe Reed who switched back from ICC to ICOC, and then a couple people who went the other way who were like, oh, the ICOC is not as committed as the ICC, and they switched into the ICC. So I'm not sure how to calculate all that stuff. But yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, it's a lot of people's lives that have been hurt in the process. It's
Hey, if there are any cyber evangelists from the ICC listening, you guys know who you are. If you guys can kind of give us some downloads, some statistics on how many former members the ICC has, we'd appreciate it. Just dump it in as comment. Just give us a CSV or Excel spreadsheet. We'll take a look. We'll take care of it for you. Just drop those numbers off.
so. Anyways, maybe, something to talk about that's a little bit more positive as we're wrapping up our time. So we can talk about some podcasts that are in other forms of media and also how people can help in these circumstances. So people have already brought up Asha and Nikita's podcasts. Austin Knoll has been very, upbeat with his Crumpled Paper podcast. So he
Yes.
is not just looking at the experience that he had with the International Church of Christ, but he's been going on tangents. He's been talking with people who were formerly Amish or formerly associated with other types of legalistic churches. And it's a worthy conversation. Sometimes like we have a defense system up in terms of like when somebody attacks us and talks about the ICOC negatively, so we throw up our defense grid and we're not, we're going to filter out anything that is said. So sometimes it helps to talk about other groups and reflect on the parallel. So that's sometimes helpful. I know Reclamation podcast is now wrapped up, and that's still worth listening to. Myron, shout out to you. You're doing less principles still, or MA, I should say, um, and he's doing some analysis. I think he was a member um, from just before the Henry Crete letter for a long time, and then he's been doing some analysis of the practices even after the Henry Crete letter. So relatively recent stuff. I'm very enthusiastic that there's so many people who are coming forwards and speaking about their experiences. I think every year I kind of take a view of YouTube and kind of do some searches on like people who talk about like either it comes out as either let me tell you about my cult story, or I got sucked into the International Church of Christ, or I almost did. And those number of stories and independent channels are growing. So that's a positive sign. And I hope that we're able to empower those people. There's a great deal of healing that, as you're able to work through and talk about your story, even if it's just for yourself, as you hear yourself talking about it, write out your story, certainly. And as you're able to understand it better, you can communicate with others, and there's a great deal of therapy to be had there. And then, of course, the educational aspect and empowering other people, because I think a lot of times, when I first got out, it was like, no materials, didn't understand what it was. I left 30 years ago. Actually, it was like 30 years in a week or something like that. But um, there was very little information about spiritual abuse, about cults, about, totalitarian churches, about these manipulative groups. And the more voices that are out there that they're speaking against and educating on these topics, it's good. And, it's getting awareness out there. You're not hearing the same people, the same point of view. So certainly that's something that's really good. Um, and then, I hope that we'll be able to work on our podcast as well. I know we've recorded an episode. We actually linked back and looked at the American Restoration Churches of Christ and everything coming up into the Crossroads movement. And there's actually a lot of contributing effects that you'll see in terms of like there's these practices that led to this in the ICOC. Um, so that
Yeah.
hopefully will
I'm
be
actually I'm thinking my next writing project right now because I got all this stuck in my head. It's a good thing you mentioned that. Is that kind of doctrinally? I'm kind of envisioning kind of the ICOC is like you're down in a really deep cave, and you to understand how you fell down in that cave, you got to understand the cavern that you fell into on top of that, which is the Church of Christ, and understand where those guys came from. You have to understand, the Stone Campbell stuff from that, and then you have the mouth of the cave, which you can either can be, I guess, second great awakening or restorationism or some of these other
yeah,
ideas. So it's kind of like each cave you fall into, the general Stone Campbell cave, it's got problems, but you're not necessarily not a Christian in there. Yeah, you can be a Christian and be in that cave with the caveats that come with it, the presuppositions. And then you kind of look around, you kind of fall down into the Church of Christ cave under there. I'm from Kentucky. My background, my family's from around the Mammoth Cave area, so it's kind of like, yeah, we like limestone, we like caves, it's fine. And then the Church of Christ, the Mennonite Church of Christ, where it's a whole lot harder to be an authentic Christian with all the legalism and stuff. And then from there, you find another pit you could fall into to the bottom cave, the ICOC. ICC is trying to be a cave off of that or whatever. But you got to kind of understand how the whole thing, presuppositions and everything, kind of fall down from the top. So I'm thinking the next paper will be that. I'm kind of mentally kind of entitling that "A Tale of Three Caves."
That's fun.
You do get the joke.
Yes.
Instead of "A Tale of Three Kings," "A Tale of Three Caves." So that's what I'm tentatively titling it, and I'll see if I can work on it. But
Right. It's fun. Uh, Good. Yeah, I think that, the more resources are out there, the better it is to help people understand their experiences and move forwards and, you know, process everything that they've been through. And, history is a fun way to kind of reflect and think about things that aren't, super in your face and, kind of as we were talked about that defense mechanism when you start accusing people of like, oh, the ICC has these problems that they're sometimes their shields go up. So, kind of talk about other things that contribute. So, anyways, um, so some people have asked me like, okay, how can we help in this endeavor? And I think, you can certainly write about your experiences to campuses and raise awareness. And primarily, I think I can show a couple examples at some point in time in terms of there there are a number of whether it's tracts or brochures that Stanford and Northeastern have done. Their uh, whether it's their spiritual awareness or their spiritual life office has kind of brought up and said, kind of addressing behaviors that are problematic, things like the bullying or the aggressive, the basically pushing people to give money and to spend time that you know or even getting people to stay up all night or having sleep deprivation in their study sequences or things like that that are problematic. So you can talk about those things with your college campus. I know some people have gone back to their college campuses and said, "Hey, there's this group on campus and they do these things, and this is a problem, and we should know about this." I know my internet uh, connection is saying that it's a little unstable. The second thing that you can do is also work with legitimate, if you feel comfortable working with legitimate Christian groups. So Michael and I have gone back to Crew or Navigators or InterVarsity, and we've said, "Hey, by the way, there's this group that's coming to your campus, and we know that they're planting in your, they mentioned in their crown of thorns or they're mentioned in their whatever that they're going to plant on your campus, and they're going to try to sheep steal. And we want you to be aware. Here's some, here's the primer sheet or whatever tracks that will tell you some of the things that they'll try to do. And they've usually been very thankful. So, we figure that prevention at least is better than helping, a little bit of prevention helps better than cure and, better a few people not get involved and, all these eggs are people's lives that are broken, that we're talking so many people who have been hurt by these organizations. So, anything else in terms of if we wrap up? Yeah, any other observations?
no, I guess it's keep doing the same old things we've been doing for years and years and years. Help people stabilize when they come out. Help uh, family members, especially parents with teenagers or college students. Of college students, help them out. Um, wait on the lawsuits and see what happens? There's new stuff going to come out, or if any of them kind of move to a significant phase where they actually go to a trial or discovery. Because I don't know, the legal team will probably update us on those. Um, and hopefully this time next year we'll be talking about just more lawsuits in more states that have been filed and are waiting, and see if that's kind of helps break things up more for more people to leave, and maybe some leaders that are people who know things to kind of their consciousness to wake up and help out. Um, guess for the rest of it, just waiting, see what happens.
Right, right. Uh, At this point in time, we'll turn to anybody and feel free if you're watching on Zoom or whatever. I'll also ask on YouTube. I mean, on YouTube, on Facebook, if there's any questions that you'd like to or discussion points. I think there's something that Joshua said that's kind of interesting, which is Hip and his role. Yes, there's certain types of leaders that I've studied over the years. That if you read books like From Good to Great, Jim Collins, or there's actually similar studies that have been done, like Tom Rainer's Breakout Churches and things like that. Um, there are people who have very forceful personalities or very dynamic personalities, and they're very charismatic, and they bring people together, but only within their abilities and within their tenure. And the ICOC seems to be one of those that's very that cult of personality around, especially around Kip. And we see it to a lesser degree with the ICOC, but is it's kind of a double-edged sword, that cult of personality. Like, ideally you want people to follow Jesus, and you want them to follow the Holy Spirit, to follow God, and wherever that takes them, not just because of good preaching and somebody who's charismatic or things like that. We shouldn't be have our eyes fixed on people, but rather on God, and that's ideal. And that if a movement is truly led, and they've been trying to say, we're growing, and therefore that's how we know that we're led by God. And obviously that shifted a lot in the last 20 years when they had the Henry Crete letter and so on and so forth. They had to change their tune, and even the ICC still wants to say, like, yeah, we're growing, and therefore that's when God is blessing us, or things like that. But um yeah, we can say, does your history, does your paradigm line up with what you're saying? And I think time will tell. I do see, as you say, the ICC will not last too much past Kip, especially when he retires, if he retires.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is, in the end of the book of John, when Jesus, when they're talking about the apostle who wouldn't die, maybe he's talking about Kip, because when the ICSC evangelizes the world the way they're going, Kip's is going to be, he's going to break Methuselah's record easily.
Mm, I know you're being sarcastic.
Yes, but
Right. Any other questions that people have or want to discuss? All right. Well, thank you.
oh,
Oh, Joshua has something. We'll wait for you. Go for it.
it's a question.
Would making a Discord Slack server help crack down? Actually, good thing that you asked. I do have a Discord server, but it's for a reveal. But you're welcome to it. I'd be happy to um, set up another Discord server for ICOC former members. I think Discord is interesting. It's real time. It's kind of more of like a chat platform. Can be a little bit distracting for people. I usually keep my Discord off because I work in IT and don't need the constant pinging. But yes, it would be interesting. We can certainly explore it more, advertise it more. I don't know that it would crack down on the ICC, because they would just fake one of their sock puppet accounts and join, unfortunately. we've tried in certain groups to police it more. So there's a former member variant that's actually hidden for the ICOC, but it has very little traffic. And then there's also a couple other specialized group, like people who continue in their relationship with Christ and disciples. But kind of the trade-off is that there's a lot more posts and a lot more traffic, a lot more interesting things, discussion when there's, more of a mass with, the larger groups. And, certainly I think there's a place, it would be good to have like a Discord or a Slack server for people who want to discuss, or especially like, you need some real-time help, or somebody is like, yeah, I've got a friend who's thinking about leaving today or something like that. That would be very useful. So time sensitive stuff. Any other questions? Thank you for all this. You're
Thanks,
welcome.
guys.
Yeah, we'll try to do this again, when we have more news. All right. Thanks, everybody.